And we are live. What's going on, Rachel?
I am excited to be here, Darren. It's been a little while since we last spoke, but every time we do, I thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, and I thought it'd be better for us to not speak before the conversation, so that way we lose all we leave all the juicy parts of our conversation for the live. So welcome if you're just joining us. I have Rachel Fox with me here today on the Live a Better Life Wellness Talk Show. What do I call you, Rachel? I feel like, I mean, what do I call myself, right? It's wellness, but like it's everything. You do it like you're a poet. I've seen you do healing work. You're also a writer. You had a meditation studio for a little bit. Unfortunately, having to close it because of the restrictions of COVID. Um, what would you call yourself?
I feel like this reveals kind of, one of the interesting things about language and how we want to apprehend ourselves with titles, right? Because, like you said, we have these disparate parts, but I like to call myself an intuitive artist when given the chance to give myself a name,
I
for
love it. Rachel, the intuitive artist. It's so much of our being, right? Today, people, I was doing a meditation earlier, and what came to me was this piece of information I had learned. The amount of information that a human receives in one day is the same amount of information that someone in the 1500s experienced in their entire lifetime. So this is like we're information crazy, and you can't really get around it. So what is left? Well, it's that inner place, right? It's that inner space that we develop and cultivate as an artist and as an intuitive. So I think that title is apropos.
thank
So
you.
today we're talking, the topic is turning tragedy into treasure. And although the topic is this, I'm sure we will be diving into much more. Rachel recently has gone through some interesting life challenges and also these tools that we practice as wellness coaches or intuitive artists. Could you explain a little bit about maybe the experiences that you've had in the last year or so that have transformed your being?
Sure. I am sure that I am not alone in experiencing 2020 as something that has been incredibly challenging. And we were speaking before the show. For those of you guys who are here, Darren and I are both interested in astrology and are fluent in some of the terminology and the philosophy. And there is a part of me that's undergoing a huge metamorphosis right now, just like kind of everyone in some way or in
Mm,
some facet of their life, they're going through a metamorphosis. And so at the beginning of the year, I started the year married, newly married, and with a young and thriving business of my dreams, a
mm,
meditation studio here in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up. And, after taking some experience from Los Angeles, where I met you, and bringing it here and trying to translate it kind of for the community and for the people that created me or the people that I grew up alongside. So that was a joy. I owned the studio with my brother, and it felt almost like I had everything I wanted, if that makes sense.
oh
And
yeah.
fast forward a few months, and I had a very difficult episode with my husband, a violent episode that resulted in our immediate divorce, a protective order sort of legal case sort of a thing, like very, very deep and emotional experience as well as physical. And then the pandemic hit immediately after, and my studio was actually forced to close because our landlord decided that our building would be completely residential. Initially, we were dual zone, so we were in this amazing, like New York style walk up historic building, like 100 years old.
Wow.
These gorgeous wood floors and this beautiful lofted space with ivy everywhere. And so, 3 months into the year, both of those things had gone away. But in their stead, I was curious what would be created. And so, what's
Mm,
emerged from it, or what's emerged from this really kind of painful part of my life, or very emotional part of my life, emotion and pain being things that this Pisces moon is like, okay, sure, like I'll experience that. I'm not particularly averse to experiencing tragedy. in that I appreciate its beauty, or I appreciate what it is and what it brings, and sort of that challenge as an invitation to transcendence, or like, you must overcome or go through. You don't really have an option as to not experience your current experience. So I
There's
found
no going
myself,
back.
right, right, exactly. So I found myself instead leaning into poetry. I was able to link up with a local publisher, and I'm releasing my first book next month. And
Congratulations.
leaned into astrology. So now I'm a practicing public astrologer, which I never thought would be viable. And I am diving back into my secret passion of wine. I worked as a
Wow.
sommelier for some time, sort of in a past, and so now I'm finding myself at this organic biodynamic wine shop in my area, with a woman who actually used to come to meditation and yoga at my space. So finding myself in these beautiful environments and creating some beautiful things in the midst of absolute chaos, if you will, or like what seems like chaos.
Yeah.
Um, I find that the universe tends to nudge us in directions, right? We
Yeah.
might not like it, but we have to. In a sense, we don't have a choice about our circumstances at
Well,
all times.
and what I guess, looking at that, it's like, oh, that was so easy. You made a switch, this thing happened, and I know, and we know, looking at that, there's much more going on. So, what allowed you, do you feel personally, what allowed you to have these boundaries, to honor your process, and to, I guess, like Bruce Lee would say, flow like water. It's very difficult. And so, for someone who's just beginning, what kind of skills are needed to be able to traverse these challenges?
I would be curious to get your take on this too, Darren. But when I boil down wellness or healing, I really feel like it is tools to deal with past, present, and future change. That it
Yeah,
just boils down to how do we approach the unknown, whether that be an unknown physical experience, an emotional experience, a spiritual or mental experience, all these planes on which we can have experience. We're going to encounter novelty often, right? When we
yeah,
go through things that are just true about life, like grief, for example. Everyone is going to have someone close to them pass at a certain point and encounter a new level of grief or a new appreciation and empathy for something that's just universal or just true. And so I felt as if this year, the silver lining or the blessing was that I was coming to another one of those hard junctures that we come to, these crossroads in our lives at different points, depending. But I was coming with more tools than I had ever come with before. And so it was a bit more exciting
yeah.
um, to be able to lean in as
Mm,
opposed to like bow out, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And
yeah.
then to be able to witness myself with less judgment, more acceptance, and really to integrate into the whole understanding of myself. How do I deal with trauma? How do I cleanse myself energetically and restore myself spiritually?
Mm,
How do I take painful emotions and create great with them? How do I utilize them or channel them into a way that at least makes me appreciate and, bring meaning to them?
yeah.
And I feel like there's so many different tools within the ancient and modern and like culturally holistic realm of wellness, right? There are almost
Sure.
innumerable tools that have been developed and used by people. But I think tools are tools as they work for us. So
Mm.
it's some trial and error, some
It it
experimentation.
really reminds me of, and I love this concept, of difference between a student and a teacher, and the difference between a apprentice and a master. Right? The student and the teacher, the student is working to the goal of whatever the teacher deems is the success rate, right? Pass the test. And for the apprentice mastership relationship, the apprentice is right away understanding that they're a master in disguise. It's a process of subtraction rather than addition. I love what you started with: past, future, present. It could be looked at as anger from the past, doubt about the present, and the fear of what is in the future, and the dissolving of these emotional, they're not just words, it's a feeling, it's an atmosphere. And that, as you said, going into those challenges as opposed to kind of shying away, and allowing that process to be transformative, often like a butterfly being born, right? The caterpillar literally dissolves itself into a mush of nothing, and then all
Hmm.
of a sudden, this reappearance, the DNA says, "Hey, we know what to do." It's there's a process of frequency that we kind of go into,
Hmm.
and I would say it reminds me of your newfound, or maybe it's not newfound, but simply just a remembering of your love for the alchemy of winemaking, and this process of being with the plant. What is the plant like? How is the terroir, the soil being
Hmm.
developed? What is the relationship that the grape has with the farmer, and how is it being tended to? Certainly, there are also things that we can't control, weather, right? Unfortunately, and our, heart goes out to all the winemakers in Napa and all these
No.
fires, right? And so there's things that we can and can't control, and certainly you couldn't control what was going on with your relationship or with your business, but you did have control over how you responded. And I think that's what my big takeaway from what you said is the response is that we get to come in with ourselves as whole, right? How many times do we experience challenge when we're not feeling very big, right?
Mm.
Often, usually for a lot of people, the thing that happens that feels very challenging, we're coming in feeling weak, we're feeling stressed out, we're feeling like we're not enough, we're feeling like we're not able to hold our ground, right? And so that's where these tools, like you said, ancient or modern, are useful to ground our being and really say, well, I may not know what the solution is here right away, but I know who I am, and I know
Hmm.
what I stand for, and this is what I will and will not stand for. These are my boundaries. This is my authority, right? Solar plexus. Where am I giving away my authority to the world? And that's a process I think we're all learning, and that's
And I
why I
think
think these beautiful messages. Please.
I think what you're speaking to too is creating, like, I love what you started with, the response piece, because there's a difference between a response and a reaction. And I
Absolutely.
think we're constantly trying to create time and hold space. That's the boundary portion that you talked about. Hold space for ourselves to then create a response, which is much more considered. It's much more higher self as opposed
Mm,
to intrinsic needs, wants, desires. Those beget more instantaneous reactions that aren't always of our higher mind or our deeper spirit. And so I think these practices can help ground us, like you said, in that being, in the conscious one, as opposed to the unconscious one, which is truly just trying to survive. And we can have a lot of empathy for that. We
yeah.
are we are riding around in these beings that are naturally trying to survive in an uncertain environment, and hold space for our own reactions, physical and kind of mental, that really are based in um, human wiring, right? Like
Mm,
we inherit an amount of mm, predisposition to reactions, based upon epigenetics as well. And so I think that one of the keys to beginning this process for anyone who's out there starting is to relax and be gentle with yourself so that you can make space to witness yourself
mm,
and not feel as if there are parts you can't see. As if you have to see the whole picture to be able, like, you have to see the wound to treat it, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, maybe a couple hundred years ago they decided not to look and just be like, it'll figure itself out. That didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
So we have to thank modern advancements and technologies that help us see things. It's reminded, and I love your take on this. It's reminded the quote unquote Siddhartha, the original OG Buddha, they would say,
Mhm.
could see so deeply into his being. He could see into the cells, and he drew what an atom looked like.
Mhm.
And then we have, a couple thousand years later, we have instruments that now can be able to see, hey, that is what the atom was like. So there's this intuitive sense of going inwards, of really understanding our inner world and all that is there. And it can be scary for people just starting because it's infinite, right? There you can see with your eyes, there's the tree in front of me, there's the person, there's the screen, there's the camera, and maybe you look a little further, there's the horizon, and then you can go beyond. It's nighttime, you see the stars, and the further we look, there's nothing. And
Mhm.
so we get this, as you were saying, this kind of, I call it the scope out. We have to first take inventory on what's there, reminding me of like a closet, right? If you haven't looked at your closet lately, and it's just picking out and throwing in clothes, and you come in years later and you're like, what happened in here? It's a mess, right? And that can be a symbol for our inner world.
Mhm.
And so, my question to you is, in this kind of oil and water space of what is a higher vibrational way to look at living and what is a lower vibrational way of looking, um, the question is, how do you discern the difference? What are maybe not the skills or the tools, but how do you absorb information and make sense of it in your daily life?
I feel as if the most foundational tool in any healing practice is intention.
Yeah.
And to me, the discerning the oil from the water is pure intention and ill intention. Yeah. Are we intending to heal and help? Or is there intentional harm? Or is there no intention? I feel like no intention is that limbo point where it's just ignorance or innocence, if you will, as to the way things are. And the way being is, if you will. But we're all being, we're all these conscious beings that are having experiences. And I think the interesting thing about experience, period, or living, is that it's sort of this table that both unites and separates us. Like we're all living, right? We're all experiencing life, but we're having an individual experience. But our individual experience allows us to understand and relate to the whole. I mean, that's how we find wholeness. And I think the same is true in our world. And I love that you spoke about mining, right?
Mm.
Because how have we been able to see better, and where have these technological advancements come from? As a crystal healer and somebody who really works with them, hey, minerals, like that's pretty much how we were able, like the lenses on your glasses, on all of our screens are quartz. And it is said to amplify and clarify things. And it quite literally does that. And the same is true with many of the.
Rachel, we lost you. She will be right back. Talking about, oh, there she is. And we're
Sorry about
back.
that.
That's okay. You were holding a crystal. It short
Oh,
circuited everything.
here, I'll get this one. No, but it literally has let us see better into the earth and its mechanics. And in seeing better into the earth, its mechanics, we can take these natural systems and I think discern universal truths from them. And we're natural. We tend to separate ourselves from the natural world. We're totally not. We're not separated from it. We're in the middle of it. So I feel like everything around us is helpful as a tool, but it's the intention to see it, right? The
Mm.
intention to see your own patterns, the intention to heal or create space versus no intention at all, or some ill intent, which I think is some of the toughest stuff to really get around or to understand. Um, is that those people who would on purpose do something, and you realize that this is probably also absorbed from their own environment.
Mm.
And so I've been trying to figure out how to, and you probably have some thoughts on this, how to take people who respond to tragedy with bitterness, right? And how do
Mm.
you reintroduce sweetness, or how does that make its way back into the psyche in an organic way, not in forced, pseudo.
This is, I mean, it's a little personal, and because where I learned the tool that I use, which is comedy. One of the ways that I kind of see this energy that doesn't, it feels small, right? Like when we're in fear, we get small. When we're feeling like a cat against the wall, we kind of curl up, and then we may lash out at once, or we may be dramatic. It's like Shakespeare. It's just like, it's a comedy, but it's a tragedy, but maybe it's the hero's journey, right? For me, it's the story that we create for ourselves. And that started when I was young with my brother, because he has a natural genetic challenge that when we were young, the anger would get so built up, the frustration when I first saw it, I thought it was pure anger. I thought it was this lashing out for no reason, or what's kind of what we first working with these emotional processes, the reaction rather than the response, right? And so when I saw my brother get really big with the energy, at first I tried to everything to stop it, right? You're angry. What do you need? Like, you need food? Are you hangry? Do you need to take a nap? Do you need to? And it never worked, because the more I tried to stop the train, the more the train grew. And I remember this moment where I thought I was having fun with it. So I started, pushing buttons, and where he's chasing me around the house and saying, "Oh, you're horrible. What are you?" And I stopped. I stopped dead in my tracks, and I put my palms facing him, and I just said, "I love you. And I don't know what you want, but I'm here, and let's make the most of it." Like, I stopped providing energy into this space, because for me, I realized the comedy was that I was perpetuating the problem. I was jumping in the water with someone who didn't understand the world, and was judging and projecting that they were wrong, or there was something wrong, and really that everything was right. I was the person who wasn't engaging with, there's a story here that I'm not paying attention to. And so when I see people, and this has happened in other times, even in public, I find that I tend to go to comedy to help relieve the steam in the engine. Uh, and that has really been a benefit. And it's also been something that doesn't always work, because some people don't like being in comedy. And sometimes I'm being over facetious and just like pushing more buttons. So it's a fine line. But that's been my helpful tool, because it's, even watching the presidential debate, I mean, I laughed. I was just like, this is so ridiculous. This is so far fetched. If I was an alien watching Earth and I saw this and this picked up on the frequency, I'd be like, how are these people still alive? Right? How did we not destroy ourselves again? And I think the reason is because there's enough people, I'll say you and I, even though it's like trying to have a little humility. We're all working towards a better way of living, but that the life path that I decided to take was my life is my art, my life is my story, and how I talk about my story is what people see and what people will feel. So if I perpetuate the stories that are always, drama related, or, angry, or like we go back to the past, present, future, fearful, doubt, those don't help me. And so I laugh at myself when I go through that process and go, it's okay. You just like come into your moment, find your center, and then move forward with life. Yeah.
My mother has been listening to Brene Brown, and I love your story about your brother, because I feel like family is one of the closest and best mirrors, right? Or
Absolutely.
oftentimes we find, I think, that our like hardest lessons are usually our greatest blessings, just sort of beforehand. And that empathy ends up being a treat later on for ourselves and many people around us. But
Yeah.
my mom and my whole family, like, let's just say that I was definitely the spiritual one in a sort of conservative Jewish military household, like the one that was really not I tried to perform normalcy for my parents just to make them feel good, if that makes sense, but definitely
Absolutely.
the one that was always spiritual. So I finally gotten my mom into, some more astrology. She's now found her people that she's feeling comfortable listening to.
Cool.
And the thing that really spoke to my mom recently, and this is something that we've been working on as a family, and I think people are always working on, is stopping to realize or remember the story.
Mm,
Like that I am telling myself a story, and so is insert person here, and so
yep.
is everyone. So if we can witness the story, we can recognize what parts of it are unknowable to
Yeah.
us, actually, and are that kind of projection or are that sort of presupposition or automatic, implementation of something that we assume. And I feel as if catching ourselves in that story, it helps us to also then be less self-focused,
Hmm.
because oftentimes that anxiety, it comes when we worry about ourselves, like how are they perceiving me? Um, how do I look in this thing, or am I uncomfortable? Am I being weird? And if you step back and out, right? That's a story that we're telling ourselves because really nobody's thinking about us because they're indeed the storyteller and protagonist in their own head.
Absolutely.
And at some level, I mean, that story is it's feedback that our brain is giving us to try and help us move along and work through environments. But the brain fills in information that it doesn't know. The same is true with our physical field of vision, right? There's this space right here, and yet we have a seamless field.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that. And I think healing with family, you have to find approaches. And so Brene Brown worked for my mom. Humor works best for my siblings. And I think humor in its self-deprecating form, it's just humility, um, or it allows for humility. And I mean, why did Shakespeare write comedies and tragedies? Well, because people had to release emotion. It's a catharsis thing, right? Like releasing emotion by way of laughing. It's almost like breath work. Like it literally has this therapeutic effect. I think just like sobbing does, right? It has this very deeply therapeutic and cleansing effect.
That's
And so to release energy also in that laughter, I think it's not just cathartic or therapeutic, but also because it's audible, it allows other people to participate in your experience too. It is great.
and we've gone so far away from that. Maybe we're coming back with it now that breathwork is becoming much more popularized. But I was always like the baseball player who breathed really loud because I would hear my daddy do like karate and he'd be like, "Ha!" Right? So like you got to like throw your energy into it. And
Mhm.
then, but like it's taboo in our Western culture. All these things are taboo. And I mean, it's quite comedic that they're taboo because we're hitting a point in time in which normal, quote unquote, mind therapy isn't doing the job.
Mhm.
And people are looking outwards and inwards for solutions. PTSD is a real issue. And so is anxiety on many levels. It's real for millions of people. And even myself, being on video consistently, there's been a process of like, wow, I feel like the energy is so strong. Am I going to be able to do this? Yeah, and it's like what comes out of us, right? That's why we also look at astrology because, like I tell people, full moons and new moons, they're going to happen no matter whether you pay attention to them or not. And so are the planets going around the sun. But the tools that we use in many different astrology kind of methodologies and philosophies gives us a sense that it's happening and we're a part of it, right? Like you see the moon in the sky. Well, the moon exists because you see it, or it doesn't exist, a new moon, because you don't see it. And that this world, this intangible world, was actually the human's first form. We were first non mental. We
Yep.
were first non intellectual. We were first of nature and always of nature, as you said. And by looking at the timing of these things, we can then plan ahead. We can respond better, right? The full moon in Aries was all, it's just like take charge. You know, what are you putting your creative energy into? And then, like you just said, we have a new moon in Pisces coming up. So then it's okay. What is not moon in Pisces? We have a full moon in Pisces coming up. So then now we're seeing the flavor, right? It's like we're cooking a different dish, and that smell is different. It's going to help us respond differently. If we don't sensitize ourselves to these flavors, when they happen, they feel bad, right? I know people who have said in sessions or having worked with a practitioner, oh, I feel like there's this feeling in my stomach and I want to throw up and I don't like that, so I just don't do it. And that's the feeling that's like, that's the trigger. It's like, hey, you're paying attention. You're saying, hey, I'm here. I need to be with that for a second and see what wants to come out of it, just like a full moon helping us to release things. So I think all of these principles, people are going to find their own way. It's called the way because there's not one way, but because we find our own way, the Tao, the path, and you find what works for you, and also what doesn't. And that's also okay. I think people are trying to do too much, so it's just like simplify it. What do you need to live a better life? And here are some skills that you can take along the way.
And I think that that teacher student polarity that you referenced earlier, it's continuous and ongoing. I mean, the same with novice and master. And I think when we get used to one side or the other of anything, so when we get used to our current situation, change is harder. And so
Good point.
transitioning between being a student and a teacher and a master and a novice, I found that I like really doing it often so that I'm constantly reminded of like that I am both, constantly and I'm swimming in and out of things. And as I apply myself, that I'm able to gain skills. But I feel like the foundation of most things in general is just paying attention to the present moment.
Mm,
That if you can like step back, no matter what you think about spirituality or no matter what you think about self-work or what religion, whatever, if you can step back and consider that all the present material appearance in front of you and all of the internal appearance or experience inside of you has meaning, and it
mm,
has meaning because it has an origin that is not supernatural and is not inorganic, that it has a very real manifestation and cause thereof. And it's, to me, the learning and then paying attention, right? Watching the weft and seeing the patterns around you, which isn't that anxiety space and it's not that, future worry space. It's literally just studying the literal present moment inside and out. And you can begin to see patterns. And astrology was the beginning of us being able to see the patterns of the deviations of time. And how do we make meaningful units of time? How do we
mm,
designate these spaces or containers of time? And the moon was the most obvious, and it was relatively short, 27 and a half days and some change, right? This fast moving body that clearly physically governs things like tides and feminine cycles and all this other great stuff that we can see with our eyes, right? Um, but then it became clear that as the moon rose and set in the sky, the moon, when it's full, it rises latest. So it makes this really dramatic and shocking appearance, right, on the horizon. Whereas when the moon is new or when it's, quite small, it rises much earlier and it kind of goes unnoticed up in the sky. Um,
mm,
and it reminds us, I think, of many cycles of many things, that things have a full, they have an empty. The breath is the same. The lungs fill, that is natural, normal, and complete. The lungs empty, that's natural, normal, and complete. So there is this kind of eternal yin yang thing going on, which I feel like the present moment helps us to get in touch with in so many ways. And it's
mm.
just that call to presence, right? But we have to create space and time, because like you said at the very start of this podcast, we are almost beleaguered by stimulation these days. We are inundated with sights and sounds and words and so much different stuff, especially this year, that creating space to see the present moment can actually be trickier than we might imagine. And it's a
But
more intentional practice, right?
you have to be. I've heard so many people say that 2020 is like a whole year of full moon. It's like a whole year of just this bombardment of experiences, and certainly maybe that's where we go next. Why 2020, Rachel? Why is this moment seemingly, apart from, the mystic is looking at things from the inside out rather than the outside in. So instead of
Hmm.
seeing, okay, well, how does the astrology mean what's happening for what's playing out today? Instead, how is it transforming our being? We can see it very clearly that the energies that we're feeling is forcing humanity to wake up on new levels, encouraging people to grab their most prized emotional possessions, the things that where ego is like, yeah, I like that, I like that person, I want to hang out with that person, I want to do that activity, I like to do these things. How do you see 2020 helping, besides all the other things that have happened transformation wise, how it plays out on a bigger level?
Well, I feel like just like the moon has that 27.5 day cycle, right? That there are many cycles that are happening. And astrology is simply the principle that everything that is manifest as material, it takes one of four states. It either manifests as a solid, a liquid, a gas, or a plasma, and you get the four elements. And if you consider that matter is related to other matter by gravity, you kind of get the blueprint for why astrology makes any sense or why it matters, is that everything is related to everything else that affects it gravitationally. And we are affected by all of the bodies that orbit our star, um, including the one body that orbits our planet. And so 2020 was something that if you had asked astrologers last year, everyone was talking 2020. It was sort of a momentous thing. But astrology is hard because it is this, it's a practice that is very ancient and has much modern interpretation. It's been popularized recently, but pop culture is it has a way of oversimplifying concepts and sometimes removing what sounds good and appears good from what actually has great foundation in theory and practice. And so for me, Hellenistic astrology is where I like to go to really inform my modern practice. How were we thinking about this a long time ago? So we get to some of the other cycles. So the big cycle that's been affecting this year is the conjunction of Jupiter and Pluto. And
In Capricorn.
yes, in Capricorn. And you've got also Saturn there in the mix. So you've got these conjunctions going on between three planets. And Mars is as well, has been in this mix. Mars was in Capricorn in February and March. So for reference for anyone who was going through those periods of time, that was what that felt like. But essentially, the planets involved, they work on cycles that are much larger. And so we're experiencing these connections and these energetic sort of everything is related by relationship in terms of its space and time. So that's angularity, like where am I and what does it look like when I talk to you?
Hmm.
So basically, some of these planets only get together every like 200 to 300 years, and they're getting together right now. And so it's one of those things where you can't choose the time you live in. Like you said, you can't want the weather to be different. It's simply the way that it is. And so right now we are going through a once in some odd 100 years hard time. And that hard time is present in the sky. Like we have everything arranged as it is right now. But for everyone who's out there experiencing this time, we have our own blueprint. We have our natal chart, right? So this arrangement is going to be hitting us in different portions of our own lives and our own charts. We're just basically experiencing a great release of energy and a great tension. And so a great release of energy and a great tension, I think that we can all kind of find much of that throughout our lives and through different facets of our lives. And I feel like right now the big story is that Capricorn, the energy of establishment and order and structure and practicality. And then there's Aries, which is angular in relationship. It makes a 90-degree angle to Capricorn, where we have the planet of Mars now retrograding and spending an inordinate amount of time. He usually spends about 6 weeks in a sign. It'll be 6 months in Aries, so we won't finish with this until January of this year. But essentially, there is an unresolved roadblock. And I think politically and socially that unresolved roadblock is pretty clear to view. And whatever your definition of that roadblock is, there is blockage to unity that is now becoming evident. And we have some blockage to unity within ourselves. And I mean, that's not news, right? Ever since we were infants and undifferentiated, we've been kind of having a blockage to complete unity in our own individuation. But I think that adding Pluto, so adding that furthest out thing in the sky, that thing that is between us and deep space, that thing that only enters the orbit of Neptune every so often, you know, it's so far out there and so mysterious. It adds that underworld journey element into this for everyone. And so there is something that we have to go to the depths and back, right, to either understand, to integrate, to learn, to, I mean, I think that empathy is and understanding are hard because they're born from struggle and suffering. And so essentially we've all got our struggle in 2020. And I think even those people who seem not to have struggle, well, social media is a platform of seeming, right? We can have these open and spiritual and organic conversations, but we can also use it to make ourselves look cool if we're trying, right? And so I've been realizing that those people who look like they're having the breeziest year and succeeding in the face of all of this, some of those people are in the most need of emotional and mental healing. You know,
it reminds me of that space, that limbo space. It's just like, oh no, I'm not a part of that. I'm in my own world. Like, you know, we'll remind yourself, like, where do you get your groceries? You know, who makes the things that you that you use? I got to tell you, this Jupiter Pluto transit with Saturn, it makes for good sports. So I haven't really watched sports in a while, but the sports have been fantastic and it's really, and I say that because it's good symbology for what we're working with.
Yes.
It's, you know, we think we're performance athletes trying to finish the race first. And that's not who we are as humans. It wasn't burn out the quickest. It was, how can you last longer? Oh, you know, like, do you want to live longer? Do you want to have vitality later? Do you want to pass on your vitality to your children? Do you want to pass on your success to your community? Do you want to develop something that lives beyond just you? I think that's the other pole of this, I guess, in Tarot, the Tower card of Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, in exactly. And sometimes the dissolving is, you know, what's underneath, right there. And I'm not going to say this is the truth, but there's some stipulation that the Great Pyramids of Giza are simply we put this thing on top of whatever's underneath in order to keep trying to build up, and that the real treasure may be inside something that we'll never be able to, at least in this life, see and feel, but that the treasure is still there. The treasure is within us. You're born with treasure, and that's your DNA, right? Your ability to not just survive, but the ability to, I guess we could say, be in all of our energy centers, to notice when an energy center is off, to notice when we're in a world and that's I don't feel like I'm on the right path. Let me pivot and go into feeling more like, where is my center? And I think that's what challenges, and this time period that you're talking about, this potential for energy to really come up, is like, it can be used for good as much as it has been used for negative, right? I've seen some bike riders do amazing races that nobody else thought they could ever do, because somehow, and I'm sure if I looked at their natal charts, you would see these connections deeper. But that it simply says, if we're, in our own comedy, our own tragedy, our own whatever, our own heroes, our performance, it's a performance, right? And we're saying, okay, the energies are large. That means I need to pay attention more, which means I spend more time looking and less time doing, more time figuring out and getting a bigger, grander sense of what does this mean, instead of just reacting. And I see that with businesses too. And certainly I wanted to do that right away. As soon as, the energy started changing, I thought, well, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to do, videos 6 days a week. And that was not me. That was a projection of the energy, like, oh, I have to meet this standard. And that's not really what was going to work for myself, my business, my relationship, or to be able to not burn out. And just, so there's also this piece where I feel like when we're paying attention, when we're listening to that inner self, that inner, we call it the higher self, you can call it whatever you want. It's that piece of you that exists beyond time and space, that has answers to everything beyond past, present, and future. And that when we tap into that, or try to tap into that as often as possible, there's miraculous reorganizing that happens. And I gotta say, like, this is the most challenging I've ever felt in my life, but it's also been the most rewarding. And I'm sure that you could say the same.
Hmm. I was telling my siblings earlier that I would not go back, meaning that there is no point in my life that I would feel is um, superior to, or is preferable to, this exact moment in time. And I say that honestly because I feel as if I have learned more, and been able to create intentionally um, a style of living that is better than, or that I find more healing than any of the previous modes of being that I've inhabited. And I feel like the only way to get that done is kind of like you said, finding a center. And that center space, or that journey, is such an inward one. And it's, the sports analogies are hard because the way, I mean, you're competing against yourself the whole time. And I think it's when we get to that point when we honestly and truly don't have an attachment to the accomplishments of ourselves in others' eyes, but when we find intrinsic enjoyment in our own pursuits, and we pursue those things and then achieve or create or manifest those things that we find to be catalyzed within us, or that we find have our interest in a completely natural way. Because that's, there's a balance and a polarity to being and doing.
Yes.
And so there's like, okay, I want to produce and I want to achieve and I want to perform, but then also you've got to balance that with, I want to rest, I want to be, I want to just enjoy, right? There is a sort of, there's a balance that I think is also elusive because it's ever changing and shifting. And depending on where we are in life, what's going on inside, outside, it might be time for more doing, and maybe it's time for more being. And I feel like a lot of us got pushed into this space of like, hey, you're going to just be this year in comparison to some other years. And I think that also has a lot to do with the Capricorn to Aquarius shift that we're getting ready for. So it's like, okay, let's take an inventory of this Capricorn structure of what is and has been, of that which has materially moved us forward. And then let's begin to reimagine this system to create more wholeness. That's Aquarius. Like, let us take a look at that which has formed and begin to invent within it.
Yeah.
That's the Saturn Uranus energy of Aquarius, is like, how do I reimagine to create better order, more beautiful structure, more organic and natural flow, right? And how do I tap into that energy of invention, right? And disruption, but in the most productive way. It's still, Aquarius is still Saturn, and that we still want to we want to create systems. We want to improve systems in Aquarius. And I think that we can find that present here in the world. Like clearly we're having some discussions about how to improve systems that everybody thinks is not working. There's nobody who's like, yeah, this is working completely.
Hmm.
Everything is working well.
And I've forgotten, is Saturn just went direct? Is it in Aquarius yet?
So no, it's not. So
Okay,
basically,
so still at the last degrees of Capricorn.
Saturn peaked into Aquarius between March and June of this year. So we got a preview. However, the next super epic thing that everybody's looking forward to is the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter as they ingress from
In,
Capricorn to Aquarius,
that's right.
less than a day apart. So they're going to be conjunct. They're going to be right there together. Late December, just after the solstice, so really close to the solstice, conjunct at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So I feel like there's going to be some big learning energy. Let's put it that way. Jupiter's going to be
There's an eclipse there too, right?
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
extra
It's going to be
powerful.
all the things,
Yeah.
all the things.
If you didn't bring your popcorn for the first half of 2020, make sure you get it for the second half.
I like this much better though with Jupiter and Saturn because to me they have this dynamic role in shaping how we relate to others.
Yeah,
Jupiter and how do we expand with others? How do we grow and go outward? How do we, this sort of expansive energy. Whereas Saturn is how are we challenged? How are we obstructed? How are we made to wait and be
yeah.
patient? How are we restricted rather? And so with them together, I feel like there's a certain balance that feels like it would be present. Jupiter likes Aquarius much better than Capricorn, but
That's for sure.
Jupiter will make its way into Pisces for a time in 2021. And I think because that's a sign of its rulership, we should find ourselves a little like things flowing a bit more next year, inevitably, than they have been flowing this year in a natural and softer, smooth way.
Well, as we said early, I would say even halfway through, like around August of 2019, this is it's like it's a time to recognize that the inner work has benefit, right? I think
Mhm.
that's one thing that I found people moving into when COVID hit is also like, oh, I don't want to do inner work. I don't want to do meditation. There's no use for it. I can't meditate. I can't get still. Like, I don't want to learn about myself. I don't have time to learn about myself. Now everyone has all the time in the world. So if you're going to use this time period to not work on yourself, then that may make that ingress from Capricorn to Aquarius a little bit more crunchy, because if we haven't said, hey, what do we need to clear out? Maybe there's that thing in your quote unquote emotional closet that you're holding on to because maybe it's like that shirt that you bought and you were like, wait, why is the tag still on it? It's been 3 years. Maybe it's just time to like gift that to the Goodwill and move forward, right? Because
Mhm.
there's new clothes that are more expansive and there's new solutions that we couldn't have before. I mean, the incredibleness with even the technology that we're using today to make this happen didn't exist 6 months ago. So it may have existed, you know, 2 or 3 years after, if it was on a normal path, but then all of a sudden everything's highlighted. And of course, Aquarius and technology really working into the kind of no moving parts zone. As you said earlier, right? Where crystals are in almost every piece of technology, and crystals, there's no moving parts. You don't have a crystal that has an arm on it that moves, but there is current and energy that moves through crystals. And so taking into account what are we, it's like the question I'm asking myself today and in this time period is not just what am I holding on to and can let go of, but what is the story that I want to move into that's going to be more joyful, more productive, and also not make me worry about whether or not I'm being involved in things that I probably shouldn't be involved in. That's another piece here is there were so many things that maybe I was trying to do before that had nothing to do with me. It just felt good to move that energy, and now we get to move that energy in new ways. So I'm excited about what's going to show up. Um, as well as curious to these what I call remedies of this more harsher energy.
I love what you're saying. I just recently this week I wrote a series of poems, and typically I will drop these on social media, either on Instagram or on
They're
Facebook.
great. If
Thank
you're not following Rachel on Facebook, do, or maybe Instagram too, because your poems. I mean, you've been doing them for like 2 or 3 years now, yeah.
you. And I've been
Yeah.
doing them for longer than that. Just decided to put them out there more recently, which was really the inspiration for the book. But I did a series of poems this week called On Reframing. And so
Mm.
mine tend to be numbered, so I'll write several on the same topic and just give them different numbers. But on reframing was really kind of leaning into what you're saying. Like, how do you create shift? And I feel like creating shift, you have to reframe a situation from the story that you've been telling yourself around that situation to something else.
Yeah.
In order to change that thing, especially if it's an outside thing where you cannot change that thing or that person. So you only can change the way that you respond or that you orient yourself towards it. And I think there's a lot of power in like the idea of an active reframing. And so maybe, negative self-talk, for example, we all do negative self-talk. And I find it so interesting that some of the most kind and generous and wonderful people, they speak to themselves, I notice, in a tone of voice that I have never and would never hear them use with anyone else. Like,
Totally.
definitely, I'm guilty of this as well. But, responding to that negative self-talk actually and reframing and being like, okay, well, I can criticize a certain part of my body or a certain, emotional trait of mine, but I can also intentionally reframe and force myself to play the one who is contradicting me in this instance. So as opposed to, only letting that negative or critical voice be heard, because it's true that criticism just came about, I just thought this, or, I just felt this way. That can be true. That's cool. But it feels empowering to be able to take a reframing action. Whether that be like, oh, well, I'm just going to, do a little self-care ritual right now and make myself feel really good or treat myself really well, give myself a gift, like I might somebody else that I love, or, treat myself in the way that I like to be loved, or a conversation that you have with yourself. But I think all of that gets to, like you were saying, the foundation of the work is to find those stories, to locate them where they are in your life. And that's the challenge. How do I locate my lost stories or my unconscious processes? And I think the breath is such a fun place to start. I'm not a master of breathwork by any means, but I find it to be one of the most useful tools.
Yeah.
Because it's a reminder too, like, especially when you're just stepping into any of this kind of thinking, that like, hey, you make an unconscious process that's always going on conscious, and look how powerful it can be. Like, look how you can use it, and look how you can now use it as like an empowering tool, as opposed to just something that you go through that you don't understand. Right? And just the simple act.
There's no words.
And
Yeah.
intention in applying the breath and practice. Not everything is easy. Some of these breath techniques literally were so hard for me when I first started. Alternate nostril breathing was weird as all get out. I was not about to use it until you give it a chance. And I think that is one of the easiest ways to think about it as us Western people. Just do some casual empiricism. Don't like make a judgment about a therapy, whether it works or not. Just be open to the idea that it could work or not. And then use yourself as somebody who's experimenting, see if it works.
That's right. I love it. This goes back to when we first started the conversation, to be curious about the process and not to try and define it. I had this moment yesterday, I think I posted it, where I said, meditation is not a product, it's a practice. You can't buy your way to biohacking. I think that's ludicrous. There's a machine that will help you meditate like a monk who's been doing it for 80 years. Like, okay, maybe your oxygen levels go up, maybe a little bit more gray matter, but what are you doing it for? To like work harder? That's not the point. We're mixing up our philosophies to try and